Around 4000 BCE, almost every human still lived in a village, a camp, or a small farming settlement. 5 centuries later, southern Mesopotamia contained Uruk, a city with monumental temples, workshops, storehouses, canals, and tens of thousands of inhabitants. People had accepted crowded housing, contaminated water, compulsory labor, and rulers who could demand grain. Why? The answer is not that cities made life easier. Early cities were often unhealthy and unequal. They grew because concentrating people, food, skills, trade, and authority in one place solved problems that villages could not solve alone. Those advantages attracted more people. Growth then created new problems, which demanded more organization and made urban institutions even more powerful. Permanent settlement began long before true cities. Jericho in the Jordan Valley was substantial by about 9000 BCE. Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia housed thousands between roughly 7400 and 6200 BCE in tightly packed mud brick houses entered from the roof. But size alone did not make a city. A city was different because many inhabitants no longer produced their own food. Full-time potters, builders, metal workers, textile workers, priests, traders, guards, and administrators depended on farmers outside the city. A village could remain largely self-sufficient. A city depended on a network. That dependence created opportunity and risk. Specialists became better through repetition. A full-time potter could produce more consistent vessels. Textile workers could divide spinning and weaving into stages. Metal workers could master furnaces, molds, and alloys. But a craft worker receiving grain rations could not simply harvest a field if deliveries stopped. The clearest early example is southern Mesopotamia, in modern southern Iraq. The lower Tigris-Euphrates plain was hot, flat, and poor in timber and stone, but irrigation could produce large harvests. Communities dug canals, cleared silt, and repaired embankments. This required repeated cooperation. If upstream users blocked water, downstream fields failed. If channels filled with silt or levees broke, crops could be lost. Larger settlements therefore gained a coordination advantage. Institutions could organize canal crews, settle disputes, store seed grain, and feed workers. But whoever coordinated the system could also decide who received water first, whose labor was required, and how much grain was collected. Uruk expanded dramatically between about 4000 and 3100 BCE. By around 3200 BCE, it was many times larger than an ordinary village, and probably the largest settlement in southern Mesopotamia. Its monumental mud brick precincts combined ritual, storage, and administration. Thousands of standardized bevel rim bowls found at Uruk may have been used for worker rations. Their importance is simple. Institutions could gather surplus, mobilize labor, and feed people working beyond their own households. Food was the foundation. Barley was especially important because it tolerated increasingly salty soils better than wheat. Farmers around the city produced barley, dates, sheep, goats, and fish. Temples and other institutions collected part of this production as offerings, rent, tax, or labor obligation. Stored surplus supported specialists. Potters produced vessels in quantity. Textile workers turned wool into cloth. Builders made huge numbers of mud bricks. Boatmen carried grain and reeds along canals. Scribes recorded what entered and left. The city created a bargain, greater productivity and opportunity in exchange for greater dependence on systems controlled by others. Cities also accelerated innovation. Craftspeople lived close to customers, materials, and competitors. A successful kiln, weaving method, or metalworking technique could be observed and copied quickly. Knowledge moved faster through a dense urban population than through scattered households. Trade made cities even more useful. Southern Mesopotamia lacked good timber, stone, and metal. Copper arrived from distant regions such as Oman or Anatolia. Stone came from neighboring uplands. Lapis lazuli traveled through long-distance networks from what is now Afghanistan. In return, Mesopotamian cities exported grain, textiles, and manufactured goods. Rivers and canals made heavy transport cheaper. Markets attracted rural producers who could sell grain or animals and buy tools, cloth, and imported materials unavailable at home. But trade among strangers created a new problem: trust. How could a merchant prove that 20 jars had been delivered? How could an institution remember a debt due after harvest? Clay tokens, seals, and numerical marks became increasingly complex. By the late 4th millennium BCE, the earliest known writing in southern Mesopotamia was used mainly for administration. Tablets recorded grain, animals, labor, and rations. Writing transformed power because obligations no longer depended only on human memory. A spoken promise could be forgotten. A sealed tablet could be stored, compared, and enforced later. Cities concentrated not only people and goods, but information. Religion, economy, and government were also intertwined. Temples were sacred centers, but they could own land, store goods, organize workers, and host festivals. Monumental buildings made collective power visible. Constructing them required materials, transport, food, and coordinated labor far beyond a single household. As cities grew, leadership changed. Councils, priestly households, military leaders, and powerful families probably shared authority in different periods. During the 3rd millennium BCE, kings became more prominent as warfare between cities intensified. City walls reveal the double nature of urban power. They protected residents, livestock, and stored wealth from attack. But gates also controlled movement and taxation. A ruler who defended the city could demand labor or grain in return. Urban government solved real problems. Canals needed repair. Markets needed rules. Theft and violence had to be judged. Food sometimes had to be distributed during shortages. Yet officials who solved these problems gained leverage over everyone who depended on the system. And the costs were serious. Dense populations contaminated water and brought humans, waste, and domesticated animals into close contact. Intestinal disease and epidemics could spread more easily than in dispersed settlements. Ordinary residents could depend heavily on barley rations rather than varied local foods. Inequality also became more visible. Elites occupied larger houses, controlled land, and sponsored monuments. Laborers carried bricks, dug canals, and worked in textile production. Captives and enslaved people could be forced into the hardest labor. Women were central to textile production, food processing, and household work. Some also owned property, conducted business, or held religious offices. So why did people keep coming? Not everyone came for the same reason. Some were pushed by debt, taxation, war, or labor obligations. Others were pulled by wages, rations, markets, protection, marriage opportunities, or specialized work. A failed rural harvest could push a family toward the city. A successful workshop could attract an ambitious craft worker. Cities could maintain their populations despite high mortality because migrants continually arrived. Urban life did not have to be healthier than village life. It only had to keep attracting or retaining people. Mesopotamia was not the only path to urban life. Egyptian cities grew within the Nile Valley and served a territorial kingdom. Indus cities such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, flourishing mainly between about 2600 and 1900 BCE, had planned streets, baked brick buildings, drains, and standardized weights. In Shang China, fortified centers connected royal authority, bronze production, warfare, and ritual. Much later, Teotihuacan in Mesoamerica developed apartment compounds, monumental avenues, temples, and workshops on a completely different scale and plan. There was no single recipe for a city. Irrigation mattered greatly in some places and less in others. Some cities were royal capitals, others religious centers, ports, or manufacturing hubs. But concentration repeatedly increased the ability to organize labor, information, trade, and power. What did Uruk itself feel like around 3200 BCE? Not a clean stone metropolis. Most buildings were sun-dried mud brick. Flat-roofed houses crowded narrow lanes. Canals carried boats, cargo, water, and waste. Smoke rose from hearths and kilns. Animals moved through busy spaces. Temple platforms stood above ordinary housing. At harvest, boats and pack animals brought grain inward. Workers carried baskets into storage. Ration distributions gathered crowds. Canal maintenance pulled laborers from workshops and homes. Festivals drew rural visitors into sacred precincts for offerings, public meals, and political display. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Ur, Lagash, Kish, and Nippur formed a competitive urban landscape. Their populations depended on far larger rural territories. Grain, wool, reeds, fish, fuel, timber, metal, and stone flowed toward cities. The first city was therefore not just a settlement, it was the center of a landscape reorganized to keep urban life functioning. We can now answer the opening question. Humans built the first cities because concentration made several systems reinforce one another. Food surplus supported specialists. Specialists produced tools, textiles, and records. Trade brought materials and customers. Temples and rulers organized labor and storage. Walls protected wealth. Writing tracked obligations. Markets attracted outsiders. Every new function made the city more useful, and every new resident made its institutions more powerful. But the decisive transformation was dependence. A village could often survive through the labor and knowledge of its own households. A city required farmers, boatmen, merchants, craftspeople, scribes, guards, priests, and officials to perform connected roles. No single household controlled the whole system. That dependence produced extraordinary creativity, wealth, and organization. It also produced disease, inequality, taxation, and surveillance. Cities survived because their advantages were powerful enough to attract people, because their institutions could compel people, and because once thousands depended on the same system, leaving it became increasingly difficult. The first cities did not simply create streets and walls. They created a new kind of human society.